My name is Michael Horowitz, and welcome to the 2020 Global Order Colloquium at Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's Global Public Policy Hub. This year's Global Order Colloquium is titled The UN at 75, Coronavirus and Competition. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. We're thrilled to be conducting this Global Order Colloquium, even if we're virtual. As I said, my name is Michael Horowitz. I'm Richard Perry Professor and Director of Perry Worldhouse, and here are a few housekeeping notes. First, following the conversation with Ambassador Power, we will open the discussion up to questions from the audience. Second, to ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom interface in the middle. 3, please, you will also see a chat button. Please save the chat area for any technical or logistical issues. 4, please keep it clean and safe for work in the chat and the Q&A, which will help us have a successful event. Now, to introduce today's conversation, it's my honor to welcome the president of the University of Pennsylvania, a woman that needs no introduction except for the short one I'm about to give her, Dr. Amy Gutmann. Amy Gutmann is Penn's 8th president, serving things since 2004. She's an internationally renowned leader in higher education, a prominent advocate for increased access to higher education, for innovation based on interdisciplinary collaboration, and for the transformative impact of universities, locally, nationally, and globally. She's the incredible leader that imagined Perry Worldhouse in the first place, and we're grateful to her for her leadership. Thank you so much for being here today with us, President Gutmann.
Thank you, Mike, and the Perry Worldhouse team. And thank you also, I'm deeply grateful to Richard Perry, who is tuning in with us. Perry Worldhouse enables us to bring the world to Penn, as we like to say, and to look ahead to a new era of global engagement for good through this Worldhouse. So welcome, everybody. It has been 75 years since that fateful San Francisco conference where the United Nations drafted its charter. Now, footage of that time, if you look at it, is striking for an unexpected reason. Opera halls with standing room only crowds, conference tables crammed with delegates. People convened for international cooperation, cheek to cheek, together. Today, we convene screen to screen, remote. We sacrifice physical closeness for a good reason, to save lives. Yet another kind of closeness has also suffered of late. The international cooperation that created the United Nations is strained, to say the least. These strains put important global coalitions at dire risk. They threaten to render a historically productive San Fran soiree into a devolving, low-res Zoom call. So a strategic Penn priority is global engagement. And during these virtual times, Penn and Perry Worldhouse now convene a who's who of global leaders, policymakers, and scholars to focus on the biggest problems facing the global order. The experience and expertise of these leaders promise enormous insights. The speaker I am privileged to introduce today is a trailblazer for international human rights. She continues a courageous legacy that reaches back to that San Francisco conference. 850 delegates attended the birth of the UN. Only four of 850 were women, and only one woman was from the US, former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who triumphed over all discriminatory odds and went on to shepherd passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In our time, our speaker's tireless defense of human rights pays the highest tribute to her predecessor. She cut her teeth as a journalist by crossing into a war zone to report from the front lines in Bosnia. She has authored powerful books and consequential diplomacy, with a Pulitzer Prize to her name and the 44th US president at her back. When she was appointed ambassador to the United Nations, she was the youngest person in our nation's history to serve in that role. She has seen the worst this world can offer, but the worst is no match for her humanity and compassion. The founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard, with faculty appointments in both the Kennedy School and Harvard Law, she knows the importance of good global governance as intimately as anybody in the world. She is a recipient of a Penn honorary degree and was our commencement speaker for the great Penn class of 2015. She is, of course, Ambassador Samantha Power. Joining Ambassador Power, I'm also pleased to welcome CNN's national security correspondent who has covered US foreign policy and national security for nearly 2 decades. Reporting, there you are, Samantha. Welcome, Ambassador. Reporting from more than 70 countries from around the world, she has delivered exceptional journalism from some of the most troubled locations and on some of the most historic moments of our time. On behalf of Penn, again, a very warm welcome to Ambassador Samantha Power and CNN's Vivian Salama.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, President Gutman. I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you, and certainly in the company of Ambassador Power, someone I've long admired. I wish I could see all your faces. This is not ideal, but we're going to make it work. And I really encourage all of you to please send us your questions. We want to make this as interactive as possible. If we can't see each other, at least we can talk to each other virtually. And so we're going to do the best that we can. I myself was a student of international affairs, and so I know how excited I would have been if I were in your seats listening to Ambassador Power today. So I'm going to stop talking and just ask questions. We want to hear lots from her. And so Ambassador Power, it's great to be with you, finally virtually meet you.
And you too, Vivian, and thank you, President Gutman, as well. It's great to be here.
We want to dive in this. I mean, I have so many questions that I'm going to try to get in as many as I can before we hand it over to the audience. But I think I wanted to start with something a bit general. We're talking about the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and someone who has worked there, who has seen the place inside out. You know, if you can reflect for us, what have been the biggest accomplishments in your mind, and also some of the shortfalls that you think UN really needs to work on moving forward?
Well, I think the founding premise of the UN, there are a bunch, but the sort of two that I would highlight, you know, are right there in the UN Charter. First, saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. I'll come back to that. And then second, for the first time, building a new institution predicated on the idea that sovereign states, as a general rule, get to be free of interference in their internal affairs. That's really important. But that there also have to be a set of higher principles to which those states are held accountable. Coming out of the Second World War, a recognition that in allowing Germany to do what it wanted initially within its borders, and then to see those borders expanding and exercising its writ over so much of Eastern Europe and exterminating the Jews and causing such havoc, that couldn't happen again. And that one way to guard against it is to have a set of standards to which states are held accountable, to which citizens can appeal. And so those two premises, I think, are really important and certainly really still very necessary today. On the conflict scorecard, you know, you have to take note of the fact that today we are experiencing more conflict than at any time since the end of the Cold War. But we are now 75 years and we have not had a world war of anywhere near the scope and the scale of what transpired and what, again, gave birth to this international institution. On the human rights front, today we're seeing tremendous backsliding, particularly by established democracies, not only here in the United States, but also in countries like India, Hungary, Poland, granted not established for that long, given how relatively recent the end of the Cold War was, but still a very disturbing pattern of what has been called a human rights recession. At the same time, those principles that float out there in these international instruments, you know, whether through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed in 1948, or the international law that was then built out of that founding aspirational document, you see citizens all around the world really believing that they have a set of rights and getting really pissed off when governments violate those rights. And you could say, well, that feeling, beat in the human heart well before the creation of the UN and international instruments, maybe, but it helps that these principles are written down. It helps that various governments have ratified them and given them the force of international law. It gives citizens the sense that they have more traction and more juice than sometimes they even have. And so the sort of coda to the point about the human rights recession is that there have been more protests happening around the world in the last 2 years than in any 2-year period in recorded history. Every place from Chile to Sudan to Belarus to right here with the unprecedented protest movement in Black Lives Matter. And so I think whether you, again, trace that to the UN as such, or just to these kind of universal longings that exist to hold governments accountable and to make demands and speak your mind and assemble with people who share your views on certain issues, we can debate that. But that is certainly something that I think the UN has come to represent, to embody, that states don't just get to do what they want within their borders, even though we have plenty of leaders around the world who think they can.
Mm-hmm. President Trump often lashes out at the concept of multilateralism, talks about it not just in the context of the UN, but in so many other organizations, NATO and whatnot. As a philosophical and a political concept, what are your views on multilateralism? I mean, can it succeed when you have so many different countries with so many diverging interests coming together?
Yeah, it's interesting how no matter what happens, multilateral organizations are just a favorite, what's even the expression, punching bag, I guess, for President Trump. I think for him, just to take a moment to characterize his view and his animus, I think it's kind of like a dream target, because multilateralism as such, and these organizations don't really have a core constituency. It's even on trade, as he moves in a protectionist direction, he has to deal with the various constituencies here who aren't crazy about that, like the Chamber of Commerce and, various multinationals that really, were taking advantage of the more open trading system that predated his presidency. But on multilateralism, there's just, it's just kind of, it's jargony, it sounds kind of bureaucratic. It doesn't capture actually the aspirations we were just talking about, at least in that form. And there is, I think, a reasonable sense that people have that the United States has carried more of the burden of maintaining the post-war order, post-World War II order, such as it has been. It has not felt very orderly at most times, but relative to what it could have been and what the World War II, post-World War II founders were coming out of, it's been orderly. And there's a sense on the street, on the right and the left, that that we've borne too much of that, and that there needs to be more burden sharing. And so I think that's an intuition that's a chord that he is striking, even if his diagnosis would make life, and has made, I think, life materially worse for the American people, who then don't reap the benefits of political cooperation within international institutions. So that's him. He's that's a favorite. We're going to hear much more about, international institutions probably between now and when those final ballots are counted by him. But I think what's really distinguishing is less his rhetoric and more a kind of really sort of from a factual standpoint, bizarre and thoroughly anachronistic sense that we can go it alone, that we can look out for our own interests without much regard for what other countries have to offer. And so I actually think one of the primary dividing lines in our country today is between those who just recognize that our fates are connected to the fates of people who live outside our borders, and those who believe that we can build walls, whether virtual or physical, to ensure that we can advance our own interests while keeping the outside world at bay. And, regrettably for that camp that believes in walls, that ship has sailed. I mean, yes, we will develop more resilience in our supply chains, and you will see adjustments made in light of what we have seen of our vulnerabilities when it comes to COVID. But COVID itself is just the biggest, frontal and devastating and deadly and heartbreaking reminder of how connected our fates are. And, we may scrub out from the US Citizenship and Immigration Services the phrase nation of immigrants, as the Trump administration has done, but that ship has sailed, right? I mean, you are who you are, I am who I am. We have descendants, parents ourselves may have come from elsewhere. We are American. We're defining even some of the most previously homogenous communities in this country. Their complexions are changing. And that is a reality. And that means we have family ties abroad, and those aren't going away. Our trade ties are not going away. The dependence of US workers on the ability of us to sell our goods overseas, that's not changing. Never mind, again, the dangers that don't respect borders like pandemics and terrorist threats. So when you ask the question, and I'm sure we'll go into greater detail about different aspects of the UN system or multilateralism generally, your question makes sense, but it's the idea that we could do without political coordination mechanisms when there is absolutely no way to track, for example, how ISIS is moving its money across borders without actually being in touch with other countries. There's no way to eradicate COVID permanently from this earth, a very distant dream, without us pooling our resources and making sure the most vulnerable and countries with the least infrastructure to handle a health pandemic, that those countries get our support. There's just no way to get at any country's national interests without having peripheral vision and investing in the kind of coordination that has been really rejected, I think, in recent months and years by this president.
I definitely want to dive into the COVID issue momentarily, but you were talking about, going it alone, and obviously President Trump has touted this America First policy. It was on full display once again in his virtual address to UNGA this year, as it has been in previous years. But given the rising tensions between the U.S. and China right now, I wanted to read you all something that China's President Xi Jinping said during his address to the UN, where he said he essentially touted China as the leading defender of the multilateral order. He said, quote, "When in competition, countries should not breach the moral standard and should comply with international norms. In particular, major countries should act like major countries." And so it's a really interesting dynamic that you see at play here. And I wonder, how do you reconcile between what President Trump is saying publicly versus what Xi Jinping is saying publicly, when traditionally, at least in the US, we would have viewed it as the opposite, where the US would be trying to get people to embrace a moral standard and calling out China for certain abuses of power?
Yeah, well, I think we should start there, right, and not let President Xi just take the floor and propagandize his way to claims of nobility and enforcing international norms and rules. I mean, China is immensely selective, of course, about which norms it believes are valid. It is one of the things that it has done with Trump's retreat is really seek to chip away at the point I made in our earlier exchange, that there is a set of standards to which governments should be held accountable. The Chinese approach is to say, no, actually, state consent is the pass-through for those standards. So yes, a state could decide it could bestow a privilege on a set of citizens and say, yes, you can have these rights. Yes, you can indeed. You can have healthcare. You can have right to education, so especially emphasizing the social and economic rights, but all sort of pass through what the states decide is in the interest of stability and order, and in the case, of course, of the Communist Party, self-preservation of the regime. Right. And so that's a big departure from international norms as they were intended, again, by the founders and by those who built out those norms over a long period of time. And I think we should come back to the 75-year-old recognition that when you allow countries to do what they want within their borders, or when the state is the entity or the actor that decides what's moral, what's just, what's permissible, that's when really grievous excesses happen. And very often they are excesses that look initially like they will stay confined within a country's borders, but so often in history have spilled forth and caused great instability. And again, that was the example that inspired the founders of the UN those 75 years ago. So back to Xi. So yes, he's stepping into the void. He's portraying himself as a defender of multilateralism. The ammo that he has on his side beyond the US retreat from so many UN sort of sub-bodies, like the Human Rights Council and the Paris Climate Framework. So it's both bodies and agreements from which the US has pulled back. And, China just sees this as it's much easier to get its way when US diplomats aren't there hustling and, playing kind of team captain in the pickup game that is multilateral action, right? Like multilateral outcomes don't come about without a huge amount of energetic jockeying and, use of incentives and disincentives to bring countries to your side. That's how we built the ISIS coalition and international law to thwart ISIS's expansion back in the Obama years. That's how we built the anti-Ebola coalition. It's not that you say, oh, Ebola is bad, everybody come together. It's that, extended, relentless diplomacy to get particular countries to do particular things at particular times in order to deal with particular crises. So she's, by stepping forward on COVID and announcing that if a vaccine becomes available, that China will be, responsible for distributing that in the farthest reaches of the world. I mean, if you're scared, and we've all experienced a lot of fear and great sadness in these last months, and someone comes riding on a white horse with a vaccine that actually works and that can allow, your kids to go back to school. I mean, something like 800 million kids, according to UNICEF, are not in school right now because of COVID. 80 million kids are not getting vaccinated just with the traditional vaccinations around measles and polio and so forth because of COVID. If President Xi comes in and occupies that leadership role and delivers, that is going to be something that families all around the world remember for a long time. And, I think the other supplement to the point that he often makes about multilateralism is almost it's a badge of honor to be unpopular in the world, because it means you're looking out for Americans and you don't care about Paris, France, you care about Detroit, Michigan, and that you're portraying outward disdain for your form of leadership as ipso facto a reflection of how you're leading for your own citizens, and that you don't give a darn about what others think of you. And I get that, but I get that that's how it's used. But the challenge is when, especially in democracies, when the U.S. standing or whether standing of a U.S. president falls to beneath that of President Putin and President Xi, as it has in the recent Pew polls in many key Democratic partners, that actually makes it harder for those leaders to do hard things with us. And one of the hard things that Trump is asking European governments to do, for example, is increase their defense spending, something that President Obama and I and other officials in his administration really pushed on. That's something European countries need to do, but it actually perversely gets harder when you expend capital just with gratuitous insults or with pulling out of the World Health Organization at the height of a crisis, or underfunding global goods that every country will benefit from those goods being available to countries that couldn't otherwise afford it. So it just like there's the cascading effects well beyond multilateral institutions of this set of moves, and the cascading benefits for President Xi and his greater ability to chip away at those rules within the UN, absent much competition and contestation, for at least for now, as democracies kind of wander a little bit without that leadership that they're used to. I mean, the net gain for objectives that do not mirror even President Trump's is really quite stark.
So I want to focus in a little bit. Obviously, this is also talking about coronavirus, and it's a huge issue that is impacting all of our lives. I want to talk about the World Health Organization a little bit, which is obviously one of the UN specialized agencies. President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the World Health Organization, accusing the WHO of being under China's control in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, saying that they did not kind of really push back on the lack of transparency and other issues. Vice President Biden has condemned the move, saying, quote, Americans are safer when America is engaged in strengthening global health, and he vowed to rejoin the WHO if he is elected president. And so can you tell me, are they both right? Is the president right to sort of go after the WHO with regard to China and maybe other countries that aren't as transparent and could have kind of helped this along? Or do you think that, again, this is just kind of a way that the Trump administration is facilitating a broader battle with China in terms of its competition?
I think that what is important to understand about all UN bodies or multilateral bodies is that they are buildings, and they are stages on which countries come to act in their own interests. It's kind of old-fashioned, kind of clear-eyed, not a lot of romance in that description, I'm afraid, but luckily some number of countries believe that promoting human rights or vaccinating children is in their interest or sufficiently in accordance with their values that it sort of feels the same. And that's how the United States has acted by and large, with exceptions, when it comes to especially the humanitarian agencies within the UN system. What happened with President Trump is that, of course, at the highest levels of government, there was constant signaling about disdain for multilateral organizations. And the signaling was not just in the president's organization or this agreement or that, but it was also in staffing. And while we, the United States and the Trump administration, had technical experts, which is really important, seconded to the World Health Organization, providing insight and information. These are really talented people, and also pulling information out of the World Health Organization. The executive board, which is the kind of governing board to whom the executive director of the World Health Organization has to answer, has a seat that forever has been occupied by the US. And guess whether that seat was filled? Of course not, right? Because the system doesn't lie. Like, the system of how the US government works is going to reflect the priorities and the prejudices, I guess, in some ways, of whoever is occupying that office. And so that was vacant for a long time. The worker bee, kind of health experts who are so capable and have so much to offer, who Trump has only recently now begun to pull home, which is a tragedy for American interests and a tragedy for the World Health Organization. But it's not as if they had a ton of traction within the US system, also getting people's attention over here, right? Given the background condition of, rejection of science in multiple domains, not great faith in the so-called deep state, indeed ridiculing of people like this who are career civil servants and so forth. So the complaint about China's influence, I think, has to be understood against a backdrop in which, in both visible ways and less visible ways, the US had pulled back. In that vacuum, now, all these months later, you see other democracies like Canada, France, Germany, New Zealand, Australia, other countries kind of coming together and sort of trying to lead as a group in a way that would be more proactive in ensuring that governments are held accountable. But that really hadn't happened when the pandemic struck. And so there was a void, I think, that China was able to step into. That's point one. Second, China's financial contributions to UN organizations have increased substantially. Again, it's still less than half of what the United States was contributing to the World Health Organization at the time that the pandemic struck. So if China had more influence than the US, that's on the US, because we certainly had a heck of a lot more leverage, at least when it came to money. And if you combine our contribution with that of other democracies, if we actually knew how to do multilateral diplomacy, there's a huge amount of leverage in democracies, and democracies over contribute to these organizations. And thus, if financing is a measure of it, could and should have more influence. So that's point two. The last point I'd make is just to say that in international organizations, there is a ton of deference to sovereign governments, irrespective of what those principles are that are out there to which everybody's supposed to be held accountable. And that is the place that I would hold the World Health Organization accountable. And it's a matter of days, which at the time were very precious days, but just the length of time that was spent, and again, we're just talking about a couple of weeks, but negotiating with the Chinese, trying to get access, and being reluctant to, I think, be as transparent as the civil servants within the organization, in retrospect, will wish that they were at that time. Now, they were transparent. They called an international health emergency, but there was a certain credulousness in terms of believing what Chinese officials were saying when there was some data on the other side. And I think more jumping up and down, not just about the pandemic, which WHO officials will paint, they'll tell you about the chronology, and they say, we were jumping up and down about the pandemic or about the virus. They were, that's true. But jumping up and down about the denial of access. I think to be more vocal and more frontal in circumstances like that, when sovereign governments are not allowing themselves to be held accountable, when they're not allowing visits, when they're clearly engaged in some form of a cover-up, and recall the cover-up inside China as well, silencing the voices of people who raised the alarm early, detaining them and so forth. So, the kind of international version of that was playing out. And I think the World Health Organization spent too long doing the sort of diplomatic niceties and not calling them out. I will say that as I encourage that kind of action by international civil servants, it is the kind of thing that they will need to do equally as it relates to all member states. And so what Trump would have them do is call out China and then be quiet in the event that we're handling COVID in a blunderous way, right? In other words, Trump wants there to be double standards across the board, where it's, slam China left and right, but leave us alone to do things as we may. And the U.S., nothing has harmed the global economy more than the U.S. mishandling of the COVID pandemic. Nothing has had more of a pronounced effect on public health in developing countries where the WHO works, than, for example, the US suspending funding and not being in a position to restart our economy because of how badly this has been handled. And so that's having a huge effect. Would President Trump also want the World Health Organization to be out there with a scorecard, judging US actions? I doubt it. And so we just have to know that in urging this more vocal, proactive approach by the civil servants who are, again, being subjected to all kinds of influences day to day, that's something that, we need to wish to see across the board, across the international system.
Fascinating. I have about 15 more questions that I would love to ask, but unfortunately, in the interest of time, I am going to try to hand it over to those in the audience. And I warn you all now, this is like the behind the scenes of a Zoom panel where I'm like juggling different pieces of technology here. And I don't know if I'm doing it that gracefully, so just bear with me. But, obviously we remember Ambassador Power confronting the Russians at the UN on numerous occasions, including with regard to Syria, and I hope that comes up, nuclear warfare, and she's talked a little bit about sort of rising interest in conflict of Armenia and Azerbaijan. There's so much to talk about, so I hope that some of that is touched upon in these. Okay, so I don't have any names. I apologize for those of you out there who are asking questions, but I do have your questions. First, Ambassador Power, if you had to highlight the #1 priority for the U.S. engagement with the UN over the next 4 years, what would it be?
You're going to hate me if you don't already, but I think the only way to talk about the, quote, return to the UN, the restoration of US leadership, or the rebooting, or the, what a kind of America, for the 21st century within the UN, what that needs to look like is, I'm sorry, but to start at home. And my national security colleagues, our foreign policy colleagues, I've got 50 things on my to-do list at the UN, but our ability, particularly with China throwing its weight around more and more, with it now as the #2 donor to the UN system as a whole, now that it has more than 2,000 peacekeepers active within UN peacekeeping around the world, now that it is a leader in solar and clean energy at a time when the United States has retreated from Paris. Take climate, which is, on everybody's, not everybody's, but on anybody who's supporting Vice President Biden's, sort of top tier of priorities. There's a set of things we do on day one to return to the Paris Agreement, yes. But that return to the Paris Agreement is a symbolic move unless and until we have put in place, incredibly stringent car rules and rules for clean power plants, rules that in the first instance may return to what Trump has undone, but very quickly need to accelerate the timeline that where the Obama administration left things, because we've now lost 4 years and we're seeing every minute of every day in some pocket of the world the human consequences of losing more time, and even just the status quo and how awful that is. So climate's just one example where there's this domestic undergirding and domestic set of moves that have to be made that will influence our ability also to get China to accelerate the timeline that was mentioned, or that you mentioned President Xi's speech. But the other dimension of that speech is that President Xi committed to China being carbon neutral by 2060. And for the US to have leverage to move that forward, because 2060, my goodness, where will we be by then? And I don't underestimate the degree of difficulty in doing even that for China, which is so fossil fuel dependent in its development right now. But for us to have the standing to influence China, the world's largest emitter, again, that will stem from us having our own house in order. Our democracy would be a secondary, and I could go through them all, but I'll just make this my last point in response to the question. But the fact that we have so many sophisticated rules and indeed so many enabling court decisions that have made voting so hard in this country, deliberate campaigns of suppression, and stripping people of the rolls, even just sort of small things like, the fact that, there's no national holiday for voting, and employers, are not enlisted or encouraged, at least by many politicians to give their staff time off work. All the hubbub now about even commitments about whether certain people are going to recognize the results of the election. I mean, needless to say, unless we do better on these fronts, unless it is clear that the world's most powerful democracy is practicing what it preaches for other countries, the future US ambassador to the UN's ability to encourage free and fair elections, to hold countries accountable on the democracy agenda at the time when freedom is in decline, as we talked about earlier, that's really going to be blunted by these very visible defects in our own democracy. And related to that, of course, is the matter of racial injustice. And it's, you'd be amazed at how many people are not only watching the protests, that's well known, and we've seen those protests, Black Lives Matter protests, spread all around the world, that's well understood. But, my experience of being UN ambassador, the way in which my colleagues from other countries were tracking legislation that was pending, for example, Obama's healthcare law and the rocky journey that had to finally being made law, Supreme Court decisions on gerrymandering, or before that, Citizens United, the degree of knowledge about what progress or regressions are happening when it comes to our democracy, that's all being really carefully tracked. And so the fact that today, even though so much progress has yet to be made, but that already the protests have secured changes to the rules as it relates to policing in an effort at least to curb violence against people of color, 42 of America's 50 largest cities, that those changes have occurred. that will become a big part of our return to the UN and our effort to secure reforms there, and our effort to push the organization in a more democratic and human rights respecting direction after 4 years in which China has sought to move it in the other direction.
Fascinating. We have about 13 minutes left. I'm going to try to get a couple more in. This one sounds fascinating. And I hope to get through as many of your questions. All of you are asking amazing questions. Does the Security Council P5 structure and the veto need to be reformed, especially with regard to intervention in genocide and mass atrocities?
That's a great question, and thank you for it, an issue close to my heart. So let me first say, just on reform, not to burst anybody's bubble, and this is, maybe well known by now, but the reason that not a single Security Council reform has occurred since 1965, 55 years ago, 20 years after the founding of the UN, is that it requires 2/3 of the UN membership to agree, and it requires all 5 of the permanent members to agree. So veto reform, when it comes to the equivalent of kind of what here is a constitutional amendment in our country, that is a really tall mountain to climb. And so that the reform that was made in 1965, I'm kind of embarrassed to say, again, the single UN Security Council reform was a modest expansion of the number of countries, number of non-permanent members that would sit on the Security Council. Can you believe it? One reform, and that's just increasing the number of non-permanent members by a few. So because the Russia, China, we can leave the US even out of it for the time being, but the odds, for example, of them, China agreeing to Japan or India, France and the UK are very for Security Council reform, but I think it's because they know it's never going to happen. They're not going to be presented again with the question of whether they want to, in the case of France, take their veto and channel it through a European Union seat, which is, one of the proposals that might be out there. The United Kingdom never has to deal with the imminent possibility of Germany or Italy or any one of a number of countries being on the council. So Security Council reform, just degree of difficulty on a scale of 1 to 10 is 1 million, because of the particular opposition of particular permanent members mainly, but also getting across that 2/3 threshold is really tough because there's so many regional rivalries out in the world. However, your point about the veto as it relates to mass atrocities, there are other ways besides clearing that really high bar procedurally that could make it much less likely that permanent members would extend a veto in mass atrocity situation. I shouldn't say much less likely, but less likely at least. And that is, and there have been a number of initiatives, including one by France, one by, I think it's called the ACT UP initiative or ACT initiative, the accountability, transparency group within the General Assembly. And speaking for dozens and dozens of countries, just asking the permanent members to renounce in terms of an oral commitment or a verbal commitment, maybe even a contractual commitment, or if you want to take it that far, but just say, we're not going to use the veto when it comes to cases of mass atrocity. And that provides, the ability for countries to, be able to look out for their national interests if something arises, because every country is thinking, on a rainy day, I'm going to need that veto. I don't want to give it up. I don't want to, do a unilateral surrender, particularly if Russia is not prepared to do that. But this would be a way of kind of jumping together and solving something of a prisoner's dilemma. It would be in the eye of the beholder, inevitably, but you could have the General Assembly membership or the Secretary General, could be empowered to make a judgment about when that threshold had been crossed. So I think this is a good idea. It's not without many flaws, only a few of which I've alluded to. The United Kingdom and France are behind versions of this. We had a very live debate within the Obama administration. And I think because Russia and China showed no sign of moving toward it, it felt, and given that Russia and China were using their veto on Syria, the gravest mass atrocity situation on the earth at that time, it felt to some, I guess, within the Obama administration, it's something of a moot exercise. And so the Obama administration did not take a position on this question. But I think building up pressure on Russia and China, where this kind of issue could start to affect the legitimacy of their presence and just about political pressure and getting lots and lots of countries to sign on, and hope that that degree of isolation, maybe not now in the age of Putin, but that at some point you could imagine these carve-outs for issues of such grave concern that even if the veto is still in place, that countries would be willing to hold it in reserve, given the gravity of the suffering that's ensuing.
Of course. Fascinating. So I want to get, there's a question on Armenia and Azerbaijan. Robin L. Is curious if you have any thoughts on how Ambassador Kelly Craft is addressing or handling that situation. If not specifically her, then the Trump administration in general. Obviously, it's not getting that much attention in the media these days because of everything else going on in the country. So it would be great if we can discuss that for a moment.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, there's not anywhere near the kind of visible diplomacy that this administration, in times past could have been counted on carrying out at very high levels. Now, in fairness, you won't hear me say in fairness to President Trump all that often, but in fairness to President Trump, he's had a few things going on, including looking out for his own, health issues. And so, the odds of that happening at the heads of state level, I recognize are not high, and that's understandable. But the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, convening the parties to the Minsk agreement. You can do it virtually if you can't do it in person. Shuttle diplomacy is not something that requires getting on an airplane and exerting pressure in person. I think the sense of impunity that President Erdogan in particular feels right now in backing the Azeris, the fact that civilian centers occupied, primarily by Armenians are now being attacked. I mean, this is a grave threat to human life. Lives are being lost. Time is being lost. And there have been flare-ups in the past because this issue, the underlying issues are unresolved and need, and believe me, we tried in the Obama administration to address the underlying sort of stalemate on the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. That needs to be addressed, but every prior flare-up, because of this high-level diplomacy and this political pressure exerted on those who would seek to do as has been done, which is take territory, change the territorial status quo on the ground, even if civilians are affected, there have been costs imposed, and thus de-escalation has occurred. And now I think it's just one example among many of what happens when your diplomatic bench gets depleted, as has happened at the State Department, when your Secretary of State becomes much more interested in spending time in Iowa and advancing his own domestic political prospects than doing the shoe leather diplomacy of the kind that not only Secretary Kerry, but Secretary James Baker, like, this is not a partisan point, but to recognize that there's no conflict that is too small to demand the attention of senior U.S. policymakers, and virtually no conflict, will abate in the early stages once lives have been lost, absent changes to the incentive structures for the parties. And so I just think far more pressure needs to be exerted, given, again, the attacks by the Azeri forces, and beyond that, the underlying issues, in terms of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, the welfare of people who were displaced in prior rounds of fighting, all of that, of course, needs to be addressed. But right now, it's about saving lives, and I don't think there's any way that one can. And this isn't a knock on Ambassador Craft, because this kind of diplomacy would happen. Again, I think largely through the Minsk format and bringing that group together, but it will happen on the basis also of the personal relationships that would have been built, minister to minister, through these previous years, and it's at moments like that you draw on those relationships, again, in order to change the incentives in play that could cause any country or countries to believe that they can get away with, land grabs and attacks on civilians.
Just a quick follow-up to that, and then I do want to squeeze in one last question. So we have about 3.5 minutes left. But just you were talking about the depletion of like diplomatic efforts and what's happened at the State Department. How easily repairable is that? How do you have hope that we can fix it in your view?
Well, my hope would be, first of all, that we would have a president who sees that diplomacy is not just one tool in the toolbox, but it is about the best return on your investment that you can. If you think about how much money we spend and will spend, for example, even in the Nagorno-Karabakh context, how much the UN will spend with member states contributing on humanitarian assistance for those who've been displaced, on the humanitarian symptoms of a conflict. If you think about just the destruction and the amount that will have to be invested in reconstruction, this is why you invest in diplomacy, and this is why you move swiftly in order to convene the relevant actors and to put pressure on those actors so they feel that they don't have impunity at times like this. So to your question, I think there's been a hemorrhaging of talent. The people who, to the degree that I achieved anything in my time as UN ambassador, I hope I achieved a few things. It was largely because of the mid-level staffers and even low-level staffers who made me look far smarter than I was, far more knowledgeable about North Korea's revenue streams or South Sudan's, access to armaments, political prisoners, who went to jail for different reasons. That was my core foreign service, civil service staff who equipped me with the wherewithal to prioritize a set of issues and to get things done. And most of those staff stayed on into this administration. They stayed a year, they might have stayed 2 years, but by now it just got to the point where the combination of the insults, but also just the lack of relevance to how policy was being made, because there have been no processes, that many of those individuals have left. So Vivian, my first answer would be we need to get that talent back in the building. It hasn't gone away. They're rested, I hope, although COVID doesn't allow many people.
So you do think we can restore the faith of public servants or future public servants in
I think the engagement that we see in the political campaigns actually on both sides, but the degree of activity and the degree of involvement, the fact that we have more women, for example, running for office now than any prior US election, just those metrics, the Black Lives Matter protests, the largest protests in US history, if we can channel that spirit of service and sacrifice and that engagement and that recognition that we have to be part of making the change we seek, and just channel some of that into attracting people back into the enterprise of rebuilding our diplomatic corps, as well as, again, recruiting back those who've departed, I think absolutely this can continue to be, the shiniest tool in the toolbox. I mean, we have tremendous talent out there, and it's about
right. I'm going to squeeze in one question, but we have like a minute. So I've talked so much about President Trump. Students and others out there want to know about your former boss. What was it like to work for President Obama? And also, if you can squeeze in, they also, as women, the women out there would like to know what they need to do to really get a successful career in public service.
In a minute. Well, first of all,
no pressure.
I can't resist, saying a word. Yes, Obama was my former boss, but I also work with Vice President Biden, and I think that's where our energy today needs to be channeled, since today is election day. Every day is election day between now and November 3rd in so many parts of the country. And so I just say about Biden that the most moving thing I can say about him is just what I learned in working with him is that over the years, because he suffered, such unbelievable personal tragedy, and somehow managed to pick himself up and continue to contribute and make a difference in our country. But because has suffered that grief, most recently with Bo's death, but of course also when he was just being sworn in as a young senator, when he has met people who have suffered personal tragedy, he has said to them, some days you're going to feel as I have felt in my life. You're going to feel all alone, and you're going to feel you have no place to turn. And because at least I felt that way, and maybe that day will come. And then he'll take it, there'll be like a coaster at a restaurant, and he'll write on the back of the coaster, he'll take a scrap of paper out, a business card or whatever, and he'd write his cell phone number. And he'd say, if you feel all alone, like you have no place else to turn, call me. And so at the White House, and any staff who worked in proximity to the vice president can testify to the fact that you'd be like left outside waiting for meetings because some relative stranger had picked up the phone and called the vice president of the United States. And I just can't think of a greater contrast, you know, to the lack of empathy, unfortunately, that has been exhibited lately. So that's on Biden. On Obama, you know, he's not quite as cool as a cucumber as he lets on, fiercely competitive, like a game of spades. Not that I didn't play spades with him, but, basketball, or basically writing, like he was up for the Grammys when I first met him because of his Dreams of My Father was up for the audiobook competition. But, you know, as like, think Michael Jordan, or I guess LeBron would be the analog today. But just that ferocity of competitiveness. But then an amazing ability to see a room. So that makes a good politician. You see a room, you see faces, it's not just a blur, but also in the Situation Room, just a great gift in a leader of any room. To be able to spot when someone's eyebrow was up thinking, that doesn't sound like a great idea, but maybe they were on the back bench and they felt too shy to raise their hand, and he'd be like, Samantha looks like she's not very happy about the direction. Like, oh, caught, no poker face. So I think that's looking and seeing and really not just wanting happy talk. I think that was a great feature of his leadership. And on that score, I'll end with women, because I think what I just described, why hadn't I raised my hand? Right? Why would I be deterred just because I was on a back bench, or because maybe I was thinking, oh, has that point kind of been made already? Or maybe he wouldn't want to hear it, or the meeting's running long, or, it's just to fight through and make your voice heard. Because those kinds of questions that I just described in my head are questions that I think are prevalent in the minds of young and older and even, really experienced women. And I have a saying in my book, The Education of an Idealist, that I took actually from AA, from Alcoholics Anonymous, which a lot of my members of my family are involved in. And it's a great expression, but it's never compare your insides to somebody else's outsides. And so, all the dudes may look like they've got it all sus, but they too might have those thought bubbles, but they just fight through them, and make their voices heard. And so just know that self-doubt, you don't have a monopoly on self-doubt. But if you want to make your difference, again, knowing that others are experiencing something similar may just give you that added gumption to kind of fight through it. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you so much. We ran a couple minutes long, but you know what? It was worth it. Next time I'm starting with that question, because I would love to hear more. Ambassador Power, it's so great to talk to you. And thank you so much to Perry Woldhouse for having us. This has been a great discussion.
Self-doubt? I don't know what you're talking about. Thank you, Ambassador Power, for those insights, and thank you, Vivian, for moderating an exceptional conversation, and thank you to the audience for joining us here today and asking such thoughtful questions. I mean, these are critical issues, and it's an honor to have you discussing them, here at Perry Woldhouse, and we hope to have you both actually in the building when those sorts of things are safe again. Links to register for all of our upcoming events are in the chat, and a recording of this broadcast will be available on the Perry Woldhouse YouTube channel. And if you are a student watching who's registered for the event, don't forget you're registered to win some copies of Ambassador Power's book. So then you can read about both what she just mentioned and everything else, hopefully in the coming weeks and months. So thanks again to everybody for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us tomorrow for our concluding two keynotes of the colloquium, starting with former World Health Organization Director General Gro Harlem Brundtland. So thanks a lot, everybody, and have a great day.